Hi, and welcome to Disability Employment, 30 Years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. My name is Derek Shields, and it's my pleasure to partner with employAbility Dallas on this webinar. So for the 75th anniversary of National Disability Employment Awareness Month, I got the opportunity to work with employAbility Dallas and provide a live webinar showcasing 75 years of NDEAM and 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. On this screen, we recognize the theme for 2020 was increasing access and opportunity. And there's two posters from the Office of Disability Employment Policy. And really, the notion was in linking together the 30th anniversary of the ADA and the 75th anniversary of the National Disability Employment Awareness Month activities, that we would see, well, how are we doing and what are the trends? So employAbility Dallas hosted a webinar and I was the guest speaker. And what I'm going to do is briefly provide a summary of that for those of you that were potentially unable to join us, or for those of you that did and you would like to share a summary video with your colleagues. So let's look backwards first to the South Lawn of the White House to July 26, 1990, and the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act by President George H.W. Bush. And on the screen, there's a picture of the president surrounded by disability rights leaders. This was civil rights legislation and landmark legislation that built upon the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And with this, we looked at employment, public services, public accommodations, and telecommunications, really the main four titles of the ADA. And then there's Title V, which is a miscellaneous area that helps a little bit in the, I guess you could say, the construct of lawsuit and some other areas. And if you're interested, I'd recommend visiting a YouTube recording of the signing and listen to the comments from President Bush on that day on the White House lawn about talking about how opening up employment opportunities for this untapped talent pool would actually assist industry in finding the talent they need to be innovative and meet their labor force needs. So that was 30 years ago in July 1990. So the question is, how have we done since? Well, actually, once the discrimination laws were put in place, unfortunately, the employment trends have not been in favor of what many people have been working for, and of course, what Americans with disabilities have been desiring to access the right to the American dream like the rest of the country. So first and foremost, on this slide, we have a trend line. On top is a blue trend line that's relatively flat, somewhere between 85 and say 90 or 88% along the top blue. And then there's a trend line from 1988 to 2014 of employment of people with disabilities of working age 25 to 61. And this has steadily declined from 1988 to 2014, going from around 50% just above 20%. And so this has shown the exact opposite of what the intention was in the passage of the ADA or the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act, ADAA. So now let's go a little bit further along. Here we have some data from NTIDE. And this is a report that comes out in a partnership between the Kessler Foundation and the University of New Hampshire. And so on this slide, we have two trend lines again, coming from 2008, which was the end of the last recession, through to really now, this summer, and experiencing the pandemic. So you can see this big U shape on the line for people without disabilities. And so the data shows there from 2008 and then recovery. And recovery happened around 2014. And it goes up and down, cyclical, but employment rates for people without disabilities continued to rise up until the pandemic. For people without disabilities in 2008, there was a very deep dive in unemployment rates, and it took a long time to almost return in 2020 to where we were back in 2008, around that 32 to 33% mark. And then in April and May, we had the deep layoffs and furloughs during the pandemic, and now you see a bounce back. Where are we today? Well, all along, we've had these gaps. this employment gap between people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And it's around a 40% employment gap in the country. And that even though unemployment has radically increased recently, the same gap remains. And what we're seeing actually is that employment of people with disabilities is not returning as quickly during the pandemic era as we had hoped to match with people without disabilities. So it's an over 40% employment gap that exists. And in September, we had 70% people without disabilities employed and 28.3% people with disabilities employed. So with all of the work that we're doing and with the Americans with Disabilities Act in place for 30 years, one would ask, well, what are the trends? You know, we have innovations, but we still have barriers to employment, and perhaps we can examine those to learn and see what we can put in place as we begin the next decade in trying to move disability employment policies and practices forward. So in the webinar, I went through 7 trends, and what I'll do now is briefly summarize each trend for you to consider and perhaps hopefully share an idea or two that you could put in place at your organization. So trend 1 we labeled as accountability. And this is looking back at over 30 years. We didn't have disability inclusion as a focus, 30 years ago in employment. For the most part, diversity and inclusion organizations didn't exist like they do today, and certainly equity and belonging hadn't been an advancement for true belonging and representation. So disability has established inside of diversity, inclusion, and equity work, and importantly, there's a cross-movement effort for many organizations where we see other groups of marginalized employees supporting each other in cross-movement. Next, we have benchmarking and scoring opportunities. Organizations like Disability In and the American Association of People with Disabilities have the Disability Equality Index, or the DEI. Approximately 250 companies use that as a peer benchmarking assessment tool. It's a comprehensive program that allows them to understand all their different functional performance with disability inclusion in the workplace, in the marketplace, and the supply chain. Another organization, the National Organization on Disability, has a tool called the Disability Employment Tracker that's available that does a similar analysis and assessment. So we didn't have these tools years ago, and now we have, in the case of the DEI, we're coming up soon on a decade worth of that assessment tool. With that, we have leadership commitment that's been born at a much higher level. First and foremost, we see sponsorship of employee resource groups through executives as allies. We also see executives coming forward in public statements through campaigns like the Are You In campaign from Disability In with the CEO sign-on letter, challenging organizations to join in to disability inclusion, along with other global efforts like the Valuable 500 out of a European effort there. And then lastly, this level of accountability that comes out of more of enforcement. Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act requires federal contractors to change their disability employment policies and practices and establish these aspirational hiring goals along with activities to meet those goals. They have had focused reviews and compliance checks, and there has been a next round that was announced in September, which will be coming forward now to federal contractors looking at disability accommodation, promotion of people with disabilities, along with the standard Section 503 analysis work. So this is a trend, accountability, and a lot in place that wasn't there just a few years ago. Trend 2, I labeled as community engagement. Here we have somewhat, I call them the standard connections. Importantly, there are service providers in the country through the workforce development system and the vocational rehabilitation system, long-standing partners that are pipeline conduits to access talent with disabilities, and importantly, support the talent in ways that employers aren't able to. They're there. We have our college partners and the maturation of disability centers and career centers working with student affinity groups to improve transition from college to work. We have our old charitable connections where companies still support community partners through their activities and through funding. And then we have the direct connections. And this has been really the advent over the last decade where we see social media connecting young people and all people with disabilities directly with brands. In a way, it's a bit of a transparent way of watching brands and having the disability community give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, so-called thumbs up or thumbs down to the performance of a company. In that regard, they become participating in internship programs, they can join recruitment initiatives, and of course, as for entrepreneurs, also supplier diversity initiatives. More recently, we see the CSR or ESG trend where companies are looking at their corporate social responsibility platforms and identifying that diversity and inclusion is part of that. And when we look to the community and look towards diversity and inclusion, that disability is actually a component of that, which is a great advancement from a disability engagement perspective. And that leads to the notion of if a corporate social responsibility platform addresses social justice, then too, it will be addressing disability justice as a subcomponent. And this is currently in 2020, obviously a major theme of community dialogue, and we see leading brands leaning in to social justice supports to include disability. And on this other side, we have this community checklist, kind of like the mindset of the community says, does the company have an accommodation process? Do they have disability inclusion assessment rankings, such as the DEI, and what is their score? Is their content online accessible? And do they have authentic images on their website or authentic videos with messaging coming out from employees with disabilities or customers with disabilities? And with that mindset, then the community can find an employer of choice. And all that leads to the notion of, well, is there a Glassdoor-like assessment tool? And just recently, in the last month, Glassdoor added diversity and inclusion to allow employees at companies to transparently report on whether that the employer is building inclusive and representational culture and opportunities, and that allows for disability to be included. So that's trend 2. Moving to trend 3, we label this one as sourcing. Sourcing can be divided into 2 sides, talent sourcing and supplier sourcing. You know, this country is graduating more college graduates with disabilities than ever before, and those grads are connecting in with employers at rates like unlike any time in our country's history. But with that, we still have segments that are underemployed. And what we've seen in recent time, in 5 to 8 years, are new frameworks for neurodiversity employment, autism at work strategies. And we've also seen advancements in supported employment models for highly educated individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities. When we look at all of this and we think about 30 years ago and the passage of the ADA, a colleague that I work with, Rebecca Coakley, well, we work together at times, has referenced this label of the ADA generation. It was a group that was born as the passage in 1990 of the ADA, and where are they today? When I speak to her about it, she brings up an interesting point about the ADA generation, and I think it's an important one to share. When we think of the ADA generation, we say, well, what's their responsibility? She also brings to my attention that, if I was there working in 1990 and I'm working today, well, what's my responsibility? So as a non-disabled ally, what am I doing in the workplace to affect change and increase disability representation at all levels and ensuring accessibility for employees and customers and all their experiences? So I ask you in that regard, when you look at talent acquisition and you look at what you were doing, if you are part of the generation that was working in 1990 and still are today, what changes have you made? That would be a great way to analyze how you're trending in affecting disability employment policy and practices. On the other side, we have suppliers. Entrepreneurship education and self-employment are policy models in the country. People with disabilities are 50% more likely to be entrepreneurs than people without disabilities. This is because they know how to accommodate themselves. They know how to transition into a work culture that's made for them, unlike some other experiences. And importantly, if they do start a business, they're more likely to hire other people with disabilities. So it's not just a starter place for one person, it's a potential employment strategy for many. And there's groups in the country that help in this entrepreneurship education. One program out of Chicago named SEED is a leading example of this as they push their entrepreneurship programs forward. In doing that, then all of a sudden the market has more suppliers that are disability-led or disability-owned organizations, and these strategies can be tapped into a supplier diversity strategy as a company through programs like the Disability-Owned Business Enterprises, or DOBIes, which is run by Disability In and allows you as a company to find a certified disability-owned business as part of your supplier diversity strategy. So two sourcing strategies for Trend 3. Trend 4 is accommodations. The Job Accommodation Network is older than the ADA, I believe, and I still point people to it in every presentation I do. The human factors consultants at JAN can be found at askjan.org. World-class technical assistance and support and training. They also have an outstanding COVID-19 resource page and a lot of training and on-demand materials. More recently, we see trends in accommodations with EARN's centralized accommodation as a best practice paper, and Disability In has a centralized accommodations funds white paper. So centralizing funding and also centralizing talent, like subject matter expertise around reasonable accommodation. Two great strategies to consider. We see companies using accommodation tracking systems so they could better understand who needs what, how long it takes companies to fill those requirements, and also to start to better manage either national programs or global programs in some cases. And last, I mentioned OFCCP, or the government in Section 503 before. The Office of Federal Contractor Compliance Programs is doing focus reviews and including reasonable accommodation data in those reviews, and also doing accommodation checks in more detail. So accommodations are trending. Certainly 30 years ago, it would have been hard to predict what the internet would have done to how we work, and the technology that connects us, and the assistive technologies that really empower people with disabilities with a level playing field to access technologies so long as they're accessible. Moving to Trend 5, 2020 has been a year that we've all been impacted by the pandemic. So this trend is around COVID-19 intersections. We saw how work from home flexibilities were adopted by employers across the globe. Telework is a form of reasonable accommodation, being something that people with disabilities have fought for years, was immediately used as accommodation for really all of society, unless you were an essential worker needed on site in healthcare, retail. So we found employers can understand that work is not where you do something, but it's what you do. And so this mindset shift will help employment of people with disabilities moving forward. Of course, we need more accessible platforms, but we went through this in May and into June, and are still doing it now with online accommodations like captioning and making sure the content's accessible. The immediate need for people that were deaf or lip readers to have the people around them wearing clear masks so they could see and communicate. And we've also see a lot of trends in wellness programming. Some brands doing online meditation or online yoga to help bring their employees together. Other brands having online coaches from their EAP available to really handle stress management during this challenging time. We see some negative impacts too, with internship decrease of participation, a decline in some recruitment in some sectors for sure, and a negative impact on some nonprofit partners that are struggling. Some of those partners could be providing disability talent, and so we look to the future to say you may have struggles and need to look to form new partnering strategies to help build your disability inclusive pipelines. Um, Disability In has a COVID-19 response series. I helped populate that content, and I urge you, if you're not familiar with it, to visit that online in order to examine some of the content. Some outstanding resources, including what Lainey Feingold put together for digital accessibility and remote work. Moving to trend 6, inclusive technologies. I mentioned this before with accommodations, and I'll say it again here, assistive and embedded technologies. Back in 1990, voice recognition was just being started. Around then, maybe 1993 or 4, a single version of it cost around $10,000, $12,000. Now, of course, it's embedded in many of our platforms and tools, and voice becomes one of the leading search methodologies in the world today. So we see embedding of assistive technologies, making them more mainstream and readily accessible for all of us. We have internet guidelines, we have document guidelines, and we have social media guidelines for increasing accessibility of all digital content. So we have that trend, but at the same rate, we still have the same trend of people not building it with access from the get-go. And so the trend is people with disabilities in the workforce still having a hard time accessing content because we're ignoring putting access into the very blueprints of all of our activities. I mentioned remote work already was a trend. We also see the intersection of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and bias, and the impacts that could have on either including people or excluding them. And then the ideas of some other research around autonomous vehicles and looking at how technology could help people with disabilities access workplaces who previously weren't able to access that because of lack of accessible transportation. So a huge opportunity as that sector evolves. And back when I did this event on the 6th of October, there was on the 5th of October something called the Online Accessibility Act that was passed or introduced in Congress, excuse me. And there's a blog link here. Lainey brings this up as an interesting topic. The act itself, by its name, you would think was a good thing, but it's actually trying to roll back advancements in accessibility that were already protected by law and proven in court, in case law, that to be constitutional. So they're trying to change the definition of what accessibility is to roll back access in the internet. So interesting, it just shows that even though we're making great progress with inclusive technologies and accessibility, there's still interpretations that says this is too costly to do. And yet then we have leaders like Jenny LeFleury who write about, this isn't about a return on investment. It's not about inclusion, it's about exclusion. And can you afford to exclude any customers? And Jenny and Microsoft would say, we don't want to exclude any customers because it's our mission to empower everyone through their work. So some trends there around technology. And then trend 7, and the final one, is employee engagement. All of this comes back to people. So we talk about communications and looking at the changing and evolution of language. There was a push for people first language. And then the community said, well, what about identity first language? And what about the idea of letting people choose how they want to be referred to and having flexibility between both, and perhaps using these words interchangeably? So Emily Ladau wrote a great blog about this, and I recommend you checking that out. There's also a disability language style guide from the National Center on Disability and Journalism that you could use in your communications department to ensure that you're using language that the disability community champions. Next, leadership development and mentoring. Um, Organizations like Accenture have decided to invest in leadership development for their employees with disabilities and really creating a comprehensive advancement strategy for these employees. I also work with a group called the National Disability Mentoring Coalition that looks at mentoring as a disability inclusion strategy in education, in employment, and in the community. So the idea that relationships can help people find advancement in life. I mentioned employment resource groups or affinity groups. Some of these are now starting to transition to business strategy teams or business resource groups. I think that's a trend that we'll see more of. How can we rely on our employees with disabilities to inform our strategy to the market, not just to do their job? So there's a bit of a partnership there with the market strategy. And as we do that, the employees are helping companies identify authentic representation, both of images and in marketing campaigns. Things like inclusive photography or modern marketing, or thoughts about more inclusive representation of individuals that represent the various societies that we are trying to access as our customers. And last, there's some opportunities around COVID-19 to see mental wellness programming improve and perhaps finally remove in the United States the stigma around mental health at work. And these ideas for workplace flexibility, for work from home, return to work after illness, or potentially staying at work and working while ill or disabled. And these are things that we've been working on as a country for 30 years, and perhaps the awakening that some of us have been able to experience during 2020, which has been a challenging time, but it's been an examination of policies and practices that perhaps will pivot us to better practices after 2020. So that's trend number 7. I've gone through the 7 trends. You all in Dallas and around Texas have great resources. On this slide, we have about 15 different logos. employAbliity Dallas is certainly available to you. The work being done by the Texas Workforce Commission and the State Vocational Rehabilitation Agency partners is outstanding. You also have centers for independent living like REACH, Disability Rights Texas, and then in the business community, employAbliity Dallas also has partners in disability in North Texas and disability in Central Texas. These other partners are national organizations. I've mentioned many of them in my comments. About half of them are sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, like EARN, JAN, the Workforce Recruitment Program, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. And I really encourage you to explore these if you're looking for resources. And at the end of that, this time, if you have a question, I would encourage you to reach out to employAbliity Dallas at info@employabilitydallas.org or online at employabilitydallas.org. And if you'd like to reach me, I would welcome your connection on LinkedIn, or you could email me at dshields@forwardworks.net. And with that, I thank you all for your commitment to disability employment and changing your organization's policies and practices to increase pipelines to afford people with disabilities full employment opportunities throughout Dallas, Texas, and the United States. Thanks, and have a great day.